Hello and welcome. My name is Wendy and I'm your online church director. Wherever you may be watching us from, we are thrilled that you are joining us. If you happen to live close enough to attend our South Ogden campus, I invite you to join us on a Sunday morning at 9:30 or 11. If you don't live close enough to attend, I want to personally invite you over to whconline.com. This is where you will continue to get to watch the message live, join a chat room anonymously if you choose, but also learn more about online gatherings that may be happening or starting in your area. Stay tuned till the end of our message and I'll tell you more about what those look like. Again, we are so excited that you are joining us today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the message.
It doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't hurt anyone. True or false?
True.
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 No.
False.
False.
That's a tricky one. But yeah, if you're not committing harm to other living entities, then you're on the right track for sure. So partial yes.
It doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't hurt anyone. True or false?
True.
True.
Right. Mentally or physically.
No. You have to also count yourself. Like anyone or yourself. Or it's better to do things that are helping everybody else and yourself. So it does matter.
So we are going to get to that statement in just a little bit. What we've been doing for a number of weeks is looking at statements that sound for all the world like they would come from the Bible, would come from God. And what we are trying to do is understand what the Bible actually does say about that issue. And I think by our video already, we know this is kind of a tricky one. And we're going to take a look at a story from the life of Jesus to help us understand that. Just before we do, I want to mention a couple things. Pretty soon, we're going to be having something called baptism that is coming. And if you've stepped across that line of faith and you've never gone public with that commitment you've made to Jesus, and recently a number of people have indicated that they've taken that step, we would love to celebrate that together with you. And in just a matter of a week or two, we're going to have baptism. Any questions or, if you want to connect with us, text to that number that you see there on the screen, and we will be back in touch with you and just walk you through all of that and how to make that a reality. And then also want to give you a heads up because next week we are starting something that has become a regular part of Washington Heights. And from just before Thanksgiving through Christmas, we do a season that is not about us, but is about serving and blessing and giving to the community outside of us. And we call that season Love Gives, and I wanted to give you a heads up because it's starting next week. And what are we going to be doing this year? We're going to be finding ways to give gifts to the faculty of Title I schools. Those are the least resource schools in our area, and we're going to do everybody from custodian to principal and all the staff in between there as well. And we're going to be getting bulletproof vests for another police department right here in our area. And we're going to be feeding some children who are in harm's way around the world through no fault of their own, and just send some meals their way. And then also, we're going to be doing something else, which I can't remember right off the top of my head right now. But it's called Love Gives, and each week we're going to do something that is outside of ourselves. Oh, we're going to bless the firefighters once again with some meals, and they still talk about that from a couple years ago there, and that's just an awesome opportunity to just share, God's love in a practical way with people in our community. Love Gives, it's coming next week, so get ready. And doesn't mean you have to do all of it, just jump in wherever you can and wherever it works for you. So let's turn our attention to our message for today. Doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't hurt anyone. And my immediate response to that is, that's a really hard thing to figure out. How do we know we're actually doing that? I think, the intention is, hey, do no harm, and that's good, right? But what does hurt mean, and who's determining that? Who's keeping track of that? And how do we know what the statute of limitations is with that? Have you ever done something today and maybe a year or two from now, it hurts somebody else, whether it's you or somebody in your life? Who's keeping track of how long all of that is unfolding? And I think we all know that in our lives, there are certain parts of us that, man, it's really hard to get it under control. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've noticed this about myself, that when I do something that ultimately doesn't turn out the way that I hope, I evaluate myself, judge myself by my motives. My motive was no harm. But my actions may not have played out that way, but that's how I evaluate myself. But then when I see you do something, I judge you by your actions and not by your motives. And boy, does that make it really confusing when we're trying to figure this out. Let me give you one example. You want to see the darkest part of me? Put me behind the wheel of a motor vehicle and put me in some traffic. And there are parts of me that is like, God, there's still a lot of work to do here. I know not that long ago, I had been out and I was coming back up 89, driving north to come here to my office. It was during the week. And somebody just cut me off. Now, I'm originally from the East Coast, but I have left behind some of the hand signals, that were a part of life there, because when you love Jesus, that's a good thing to do. But there's other parts, that are a little bit more acceptable, like pulling within 2.5 inches of somebody's bumper and flashing some headlights, right? Because, hey, that's not right, and you're going to cause some trouble here on the road. Well, we're coming up that hill, and I'm tailing them, and lo and behold, they want to make the same left turn that I do to kind of come in this way. And then they turn it again and come right into the parking lot here at church. I was cut off by one of you. But realize my motives in tailgating you were to instruct you about the dangers of cutting people off, which is what you did. How do we know if we're ever doing this, right? I mean, it falls apart so quickly. So could there be something better than that? There is. So here's what I want to do. I want to walk through a story in the life of Jesus one day. And it may sound along the way that it doesn't have a whole lot to do with this, but it really does. We're going to make our way all the way through the story. We're going to come back to this statement, and then we're going to talk about us and what that might mean for us, and talk about a better way to live with what we do, all of us, across the whole spectrum. So let's jump into the story. It's found in John chapter 8. Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning, he was back again at the temple. Indication is that was one of his habits to go there often. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and he taught them. Now, here's what often happens when we read the Bible. We say, okay, yeah, there's kind of the introduction. So what did he say? And what happened in the story that follows? But this is one of those stories that the setting of it is just as important as the story itself. And we notice right away, where is Jesus? He's at the temple. It is impossible for us to understand how important a role the temple played in the life of the Jewish faith at the time. For centuries, people had been bringing their sacrifices because God made this statement way back in time where he says, sin is a very serious thing and it requires this payment. And so people would bring their sacrifices one year after another. And maybe it was a dove, and maybe it was a sheep, and maybe it was a grain offering of some kind. And people would just continually bring those things. And in the city of Jerusalem, on the top of a mountain, here was this temple in Jesus' day. Now, maybe in our day, that it's a contested site. And there's a Dome of the Rock and some other buildings that are there. It is a holy site for Muslims and Jews alike. But what it looks like today is not what it looked like in Jesus' day. It looked a little bit like this. This is an artist's rendering. Well, why isn't this temple there? Because in 70 AD, the Roman army marched down and they laid siege to the city of Jerusalem and they just leveled the whole city. And they tore down this temple as well. But this is roughly what it looked like in Jesus' day. This huge courtyard on the outside there within these four walls. This was called the courtyard of the Gentiles. That's where anybody who wanted to honor and worship God could come. And then progressively you would go through these doors and it would get more restrictive each and every time until you get to the back of this elevated section in the middle. And there was this place called the Holy of Holies. And there one high priest only went one time a year. And it was serious business going in there. It was so serious that they would tie a rope around his foot, and so if God killed him while he was in there, they could just pull him out because you didn't go in there just cavalierly. And everybody who came to this place realized this is where you get yourself right with God. This is where your relationship with God can be restored. It can be facilitated. And that's where this story happens, is somewhere within these walls. Let me give you a picture of something that's a little bit more from our day. This is a current picture of the southern steps, excavated within the last 100 years or so, about 240 feet wide. And most of the people who would make their way inside of those walls to get to the temple would come up these stairs. And they would bring with them the sacrifice that they were going to make inside of the temple. And even Jesus walked up these steps, probably on that day, to stand inside of that place. And for people, what this represented, this was like their stairway to heaven, was to walk up these steps and make your way in. And here's what happens in that setting. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Who are these people? They are the experts of the day. They're the ones who determine, hey, we know who God is, we know what God has said, and we know what it is that God requires in response to the ways in which we have broken his law. Because there was this model that said, when you sin, you break God's law, and you must make payment. So on this day, they bring somebody in who had been caught in the act. And part of this language makes you wonder, hey, it's early in the morning when Jesus is there. Where was she all night? And where were these religious leaders all night? And probably they were keeping her somewhere. And when they heard that Jesus was back where he often goes, they brought her from wherever she was and put her down in front of Jesus because they have an agenda. They have a motive on this day. And it isn't about her. And it isn't even about justice. It is about separating Jesus from the crowd and making some of his popularity go away. So the motives behind this are not all pure and are not all clean. And there's a woman who finds herself in the place that she least wants to be. Because she knows that, you know what, you have to go to this place to make a sacrifice. And probably on this day, she knows, hey, there's not an issue here of guilt or innocence. But now I'm going to be sacrificed for what I have done in the very place where there were probably some sheep making some sheep noise, about to be slaughtered for the sins of people. But here she is. And she has been caught in the act. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. They are going to lecture Jesus now about the finer points of the law. And this one was a big one, right? Back in the Old Testament, here's what it said. You must not commit adultery, and that is one of God's top 10, right? Right, the 10 Commandments, that one's in there. It's probably one of the few that we know. We might think, well, yeah, don't murder, don't lie, don't commit adultery, and then there's like 7 others that are in there, but we know that's a big one. And for them in that day, it was huge. And so they naturally asked in response, well, the law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say, Jesus? And remember what their motive is, their agenda. They're trying to make Jesus take a side on this issue that for them is so clear. And Jesus could have said in response, you know what, hey, if you're so clear about what she's done, why did you even drag her here? Why didn't you just do what the law says? Why are you doing that? And if Jesus had been a little snarky, maybe a little bit more like me, I wonder if he might have pointed out, one of these statements that, hey, here's what it actually says back there in the law of Moses. If a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, hey, what's missing from this picture? Oh, okay. This really isn't about justice, is it? This really isn't about what's right before God. This is about a picture of something totally different, and the one who understands our motives better than we know them ourselves understood what was happening on that day. They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. And it's hard for us to know how important and how just electric this moment is, because what they're saying is, hey, Moses told us this is what happens to somebody just like this, and we caught her doing that. What are you going to do, Jesus? And they're trying to set Jesus up against Moses. You're going to go against what he says, and people are going to say, we can't trust this guy because he disagrees with Moses. And if you go with him, that really forces you to be old school and hardcore, and you're going to pick up a rock, and you're going to follow through. It's also setting Jesus up against the law. And nobody challenged the law in that day. This is setting Jesus up against the temple. You think you're greater than the temple that's right here? There's nothing greater than this, Jesus. Do you claim to be that? And I wonder if at this moment, the disciples who were there, and remember, there was a crowd around, and I wonder if they're thinking, oh boy, I don't think this is going to turn out well. They start moving back. Ma'am, come on up here where you can see a little bit better. Sir, come up here. And we're just going to hang out in the back here. John, you're writing this down because this might be important really later, but we're just going to hang out in the back here. This is not good. They were trying to trap him so that they could use something against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. Now that's an odd response, don't you think? Why would Jesus do that? Why not just give him an answer? And maybe we're making a little bit more out of this than there really is here, but there's a parallel that I think is impossible to ignore. Because for a long time, the Jews of that day looked at a verse in Deuteronomy that, basically said this. This is Moses speaking. The Lord gave me 2 stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God. It's a figure of speech of when God, who is Spirit, gave the law. And they saw it as written by the finger of God. And on this day, what is Jesus doing? Writing on the ground with his finger. Who is this guy? Who does he think he is? And so many people over the years have wondered, well, what was he writing in the dirt? And put the staff on this, did some crack research, and we think we've discovered it. Well, you know what he was writing? Takes one to know one. No, I'm just kidding. No, a lot of people believe that what Jesus was writing was the 10 Commandments. Right? Because they were focused on one right now that had been breached. But what Jesus does maybe is expand that, because when you look at all 10, from dishonoring God all the way down to coveting, desiring what somebody else has, anybody going to claim being off limits from all of that? Some others say that what Jesus was writing, because he knows the hearts of everyone, is that he was writing specific sins that were in the life of the very accusers around him. Yeah, okay, she was caught in the act. How about this for you? How about this for you? How about this for you? We're never told exactly what it is. But in taking his time, what Jesus does exposes the hearts of the accusers to everybody else who's there. And in taking his time, Jesus exposes the hearts of those religious experts to themselves. But he doesn't answer, and so they kept demanding an answer. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? So he stood up again and he said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. And maybe you've heard that phrase before, and it just kind of is there all by itself. Well, this is the story from which it comes. Now, in our day, a lot of times that phrase is used this way, that if somebody comes against me and wants to talk about something in my life, I push back by saying, hey, who are you to throw stones? Well, we got to recognize that's not how that phrase was used on that day. Because it's not the woman who says that back to her accusers, but the only one in the crowd that day who didn't have any sin says it to the ones who were accusing someone else of a breach of the law, when in reality, do you know how many people are guilty of that on that day in that crowd? Every one of them, minus one. And so the only one who could have talked about sin and no sin didn't pick up a rock on that day, but rather drew attention on everybody's part to who they are. And right there in that place where people were in the process of making sacrifices for their sin, Jesus draws attention, even to religious leaders who in this moment are making special interpretation to manipulate those seeking to follow God. What does Jesus do then? Then he stooped down again and he wrote in the dust again. And the result of that, when the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one. Think about this. They're in the very place where it's all about being made right with God, paying for your sins. But now they leave. And there's an interesting detail, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Why would the oldest leave first? I wonder if they understood better than anyone. You know how many years I've been walking up those steps to come and make payment for my sin? Do you know how many times I've had to say, yep, there it is again? That perhaps experience had taught them. As hard as I try to keep the law in all of the ways that it can possibly be kept, I haven't done it. And so they leave. And now, in the middle of the crowd, there's just Jesus and the woman. The accusers are gone. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? And the word condemn here is not, the idea, did anybody accuse you? Because certainly we know that's true. This isn't a word about, hey, is it guilt or innocence? She'd pretty much admitted her guilt. There was no question about that. Condemn carries the idea of making payment. Has no one forced you to make payment for your sin? Has nobody made you do that? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, and some of you, this may even be why you're here today, is Jesus' response, and we need to hear all of it. Neither do I. Now go and sin no more. Jesus says, you know what? I don't condemn you. I'm not going to make you make payment for your sin. And he's not winking and nodding and smiling and saying, yeah, they way oversold that whole seriousness of the breach of God's law. He's not saying that at all. Because it's only a short time later that Jesus would allow himself to be nailed to a cross to do what? To make payment. See, all those sacrifices, they were temporary. He came to make a sacrifice that was permanent. Sin is serious. And there is a payment. And Jesus is saying, you know what? I'll pay for your sin. I'll pay for your adultery. And Jesus made payment for your adultery, or whatever it might be. But then the rest of it, go and sin no more. What Jesus invites her, challenges her, calls her to do, leave your sin behind. Don't go back there. And what sounds so impossible before Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection is something that when he was raised again from the dead, part of the New Testament goes on to say that, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is available in a relationship with God to live for God. So he says, look, I'm not going to make you make payment. I'm going to make payment soon. I am calling you, challenging you to leave your sin behind. Why would he do that? It's because of the inevitable impact of sin that Jesus calls us away from it. All sin comes with prepackaged consequences attached to it. Right? Sin always hurts. It always destroys. It always tears down. And ultimately, it kills. Sin kills our conscience. And the things that bothered us once upon a time, they don't bother us anymore, but there's probably something even inside of ourselves saying it should bother me, but it doesn't. What happened? Sin killed it. Sin kills our self-respect. We do things that if we thought that people around us would find out about them, that they would lose all respect for us. Maybe we don't even respect ourselves. What would ever make me do that and do it again and again and again? Sin. Sin kills relationships. There are friendships, marriages that have died as a result of it. Sin always hurts. It always destroys. And ultimately, it always kills. And that's why a statement like, hey, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't hurt anyone, what does that really mean? Because ultimately, all of us will do what we are by nature and by choice, and that is to sin. And every time it hurts the one doing it. And sin is no respecter of persons, and there's a lot of collateral damage that goes along with it, and it hurts the ones that we love as well. And oh, by the way, the Bible says there is no one righteous, not even one. So it's not an issue of guilty or innocent people in this room. We are who we are. Let me give you maybe a little bit of a picture of what that means. I've got a plate full of brownies up here. Anybody want a brownie? It's the breakfast of champions, is what I've been told. Yeah, and the ingredients in brownies, you got eggs, and you got some flour, and you got some oil in there, and of course, a whole bunch of chocolate in there. So, come and help yourself. I should tell you, though, I put one extra special ingredient in these brownies, and it's just a little bit of manure is in there as well. You say, what does that have to do with this? See, by our very nature, there's this condition inside of ourselves. And we're not always as bad as we could possibly be, but there is something mixed into the very fabric of who we are that determines that ultimately, sooner or later, and I don't know about you, for me it's sooner, I will miss God's mark, and that's what sin means. And every time that happens, it hurts me, and it hurts people around me. And so what are we to do in response to that? You know what Jesus did on that day? He didn't condemn her. He didn't wink at what she had done either. And he knows better than anyone that sin ultimately destroys. And because of that, he calls us away from it. He says, don't go back there. And inside of a relationship with God, you have been given by God the ability to live life together with him. And the only one who never sinned calls us away from sin because he knows, it hurts. Doesn't matter what you do as long as you don't hurt anyone. That just is not realistic. Because by nature and by choice, that's what we do. We sometimes skirt that and rename it, but the truth is, that's who we are. So what we do, which ultimately is miss God's mark, we're all in the same boat. Doesn't mean it's going to look exactly the same for everybody, but it's the truth about all of us. That what we do needs what only Jesus can do. And what is that? To forgive and empower for a new life. And Jesus still on this day invites us, calls us, challenges us. Leave your sin behind. Don't go back there. So let me ask you a really awkward question as we begin to wind this down. So what's your sin? And whatever that is, Jesus is calling you to leave it behind. And maybe, you know what it means? You need to move out. And people have pushed back on that and say, well, you know what, right now, financially, that just isn't, realistic. I'll make you the same offer we've made through the years. We'll help you find another place because we're not here to condemn either. But we are here to call and to challenge one another to leave behind our sin. Maybe you need to stop sleeping with him or her until you say, I do to each other. Leave your sin behind. Maybe that habit that is not doing you any favors, not doing anybody else any favors, you need to get some help to leave that behind. Because I think oftentimes what we say in response to that is, yeah, well, that sounds really good, but you know what? It's just not that simple to leave it behind. I know. And maybe that's one of the big reasons why Jesus calls us to do exactly that and to just not even go there in the first place. Because it's so much easier to get involved in it than it is to get untangled from it. But leave it behind. So what is it that you're being called to leave behind, to let go of? Because the one who did not say with the tone of voice that many are accustomed to and that we grew up with, and this was kind of the tone that I got from what Jesus even said on this day and other days like it, you better not, or else God's just waiting for you to mess up. I think instead what the tone is of that day, don't do it. Because I know better than even you know yourself that sin will ultimately and inevitably hurt you and everybody around you. So for your sake and for God's sake, leave it behind. Leave it behind. It's not an easy step. And I think it's something that we can easily gloss over. But it is an invitation, a call, a challenge that still stands today. From the God who did not condemn us, force us to make payment for what we've done, because he made payment. And when someone is willing to die for you, like Jesus did for us, we never have to question whether or not he is for us. And the one who is willing to do that says, go and sin no more. Leave it behind. It's not doing you any favors or anyone else. And oh, by the way, he'll empower you to be able to live a whole new kind of life inside of a relationship with him. Would you bow your heads together with me? And just before I pray, so do you know what it is? Do you know what it is that you need to leave behind? And maybe we've been playing games with it and calling it something different than what it is, or we've just said, oh, well, I guess there's nothing that I can do. Maybe we've just been totally unaware. There is a God who did not come to condemn, when so easily he was the only one who could have rightfully done so. He came to make payment for your sin and mine. And then he calls us. Leave it behind. Don't go back there. And Lord Jesus, on this day, I pray for each and every one of us that our understanding of your great love for us would increase, and our hatred of the things that hurt us would also increase, that we would see things as you see them. And God, your promise is that you're leading us toward freedom from the things that hurt us, freedom from the things that enslave us. And there in that place we are set free to follow you all the more. And may that be our desire. So God, we ask you to draw us closer to you and help us to journey all the more with you. And all along the way, realizing, as no doubt that woman on that day realized, you are the fulfillment of all that was pictured there, of what it would take for our sin to be forgiven. And now we get to walk with you in a whole new kind of life. Not the one that we find all by ourselves. Life lived together with you. And we ask and pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Really hope you guys took something away from the message today. Visit us next week here at the South Ogden campus or at whconline.com, where you can learn more about online gatherings. What's an online gathering? Maybe right now you're watching from home. Maybe next week invite some friends to join you, or go to a coffee shop and invite some friends to come along and watch the message with you. We believe that location is not a limitation to your church community. By visiting us at whconline.com, clicking join an online gathering, I will be in touch and we can talk more about what it looks like to join an online gathering or start your own online gathering. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Hope you have a great week.